Hello and welcome to the art of creating latex masks. Making a professional quality mask that's interesting, has character, and expresses an attitude is an art in itself. In this video, I'll be breaking down the process into three main categories. First, the sculpting of the mask. Second, casting a durable mold. And third, painting and detailing. Of these three areas, the sculpting is the most important part of the mask making procedure. The more time and effort you put into your sculpture, the better the finished product will look. Your own imagination is the first place to start in creating your mask design. Here, a few sketches of the front, side, and back views are drawn up. These sketches are used as a guide to sculpt the mask. For inspiration and ideas, the local library can supply you with all the reference photos you'll need. The design I've come up with is a combination of several different animals and a good helping of imagination. Of course, another good source of reference material are current and back issues of movie and horror magazines. Once you have a design to go by, you'll need an armature to sculpt your mask on. A wire armature like this can be purchased or constructed. Another alternative is to purchase a styrofoam wig form. This form can also be used as a base for sculpting a mask. The ideal armature for mask construction is a life cast of a human head. After researching what was available on the market, I realized that there was a need for a professional quality head form that could be purchased at a reasonable price. For this reason, I'll be selling an exact copy of the head form used here at the end of this tape. Once you have an armature, it's time for clay. There are basically two types of clay used in mask making: oil-based and water-based clay. Oil-based clay stays permanently pliable and is the most popular used in mask making. Sculpture House manufactures Roma Plastilina, a very popular oil-based clay that comes in 4 hardnesses. Number 1 being the softest, through number 4 the hardest. I use Roma's number 3 for my masks. I feel it has the best workability and is firm enough to hold fine details. The average mask will take 5 blocks of clay to create. Larger masks will take more. The alternative to oil-based clay is water-based or dirt clay. The main disadvantage to water clay is that without proper maintenance, the clay will continue to dry out and will eventually become unworkable. Next, you'll need sculpting tools. There are many different kinds, from plastic tools to wood and wire loop tools. Almost anything can be used as a sculpting tool. You'll notice I use mini ribbon tools. These tools are made with very fine wire and have a triangular tip that's perfect for cutting in wrinkles. With your sketches as reference, it's time to start roughing out the mask. If you're sculpting on a plaster bust, a thin coat of Vaseline on the plaster will help the oil-based clay stick better. Pinch off pieces of clay and press them onto the bust. By adding the same size chunks of clay to each side of the sculpture, you can help keep the piece balanced. Continue adding clay using your sketches as a guide. Don't worry about much detail at this point. Just work on building up the basic shape. It's also a good idea to periodically step back away from the sculpture during the rough-out stages to check your progress from a distance. Look at the profile and use your sketches to block in the shape. Now's the time to make any major changes in the shape before much detail is laid in. Since the ears on the design I drew up are so large, I've cut pieces of wire mesh to help support the ears. After positioning the mesh on each side of the mask, I cover it with a layer of clay and continue to build up the mask. I've started to add a little detail to the forehead and snout by rolling out small ropes of clay and pressing them onto the sculpture. Most of the clay added at this point is done by hand. As I refine the piece, I'll start using different tools. Your fingers and thumbs will always be your most useful sculpting tools. Notice the deep sockets on each cheek where the tusks will go. I use a sculpting tool to draw in the wrinkles and then ropes of clay to build them up. I rough out the inner ear separately and press it into place. In the ear area, I add small chunks of clay and smooth them out with different shaped sculpting tools. As I refine the sculpture, I alternate between adding and smoothing clay and removing clay with wire loop tools. I like to use the mini ribbon tools for folds and wrinkles. The triangular tip deepens wrinkles very well. Wood tools are then used to help smooth out some of the sharp edges. A very useful technique I use a lot is what I call an alcohol brush down. A little alcohol on a soft brush is applied to the area you would like to smooth out. The alcohol starts to melt the clay, and the brush smooths out any tool marks. To remove alcohol and melted clay from the sculpture, use the brush to soak up any residue and wipe the brush with a towel. I use a combination of mini ribbon, wood, and wire loop tools to shape the clay, and alcohol to smooth each area as I go. Inside the mouth, a round wooden tool was used to press in sockets for the teeth. The tongue is roughed in and smoothed with alcohol. The back of the mask has been smoothed out and balanced. You'll notice I changed the design a little and made the scales down the back of the mask pointed instead of rounded. This illustrates how the sketches are only a guide. As you sculpt your mask, you may wish to change the look as you go. As long as you like it, that's all that matters. The back needed some detail, so I'm adding wrinkles to each scale. A pointed tool is used to draw in the wrinkles in a random pattern. Once I'm satisfied with the pattern, I cut the wrinkles in with a triangular ribbon tool. The final step is to brush down the wrinkles to smooth out the sharp edges left by the tool. The tusks I'm making for this mask are white Roma plastilina. The tusk is shaped by hand and refined with a wire loop tool. For any horn or tooth that will be added to the mask later, a socket should be sculpted to help hold it in place when the mask is put together. Short horns and teeth can be cast with the mask. The horns on the forehead and chin will be cast in place. Any long teeth or tusks should be added separately. Once the horns and tusks are shaped, I add grooves with a triangular ribbon tool. Begin by drawing the lines in the direction of the tusk. Deeper lines at the base, shallower at the tip. You'll see how the grooves in the horns and tusks will help to create a neat effect when they're painted. Alcohol is used to smooth out the sharp edges of the grooves. The same white Roma used for the tusks is used to make the teeth. The teeth will be used as a model for the friendly plastic teeth that will be made later. Once you're satisfied with the shape of the mask, some texture can be added to finish the effect. Here, an orange is used to make a texture stamp. Using a chunk of rubber sponge, stipple a layer of latex onto the orange. Each layer of latex is dried with a hairdryer. To make a sturdy stamp, I apply 7 or 8 thin coats of latex and speed dry each one. The finished stamp is powdered, peeled off, and trimmed. To add texture to your sculpture, just press the stamp onto the areas you want. Here's a simple technique to make a custom-made texture stamp. Start with a piece of clay and sculpt the pattern you would like to use. A pattern about 1 inch square is all you'll need. Use alcohol to smooth out the pattern. Seal the area with plastic film. Build a clay wall around the textured area to within a 1/4 inch of the pattern. Mix a small batch of plaster and brush it into all the detail. Fill the wall full. When the plaster is fully set, remove all the clay. Here's an example of how a texture stamp is used. Many different effects can be created. You're only limited by your imagination. Another good texture pattern can be created with a red rubber makeup sponge. Tear a sponge in half and use the torn edge to press on texture. Be careful when applying texture. Don't press too hard or you'll mess up the detail. Once all the texturing is complete, the sculpture is ready to be sealed. The sculpture needs to be sealed before it's cast. Otherwise, the clay will stick to the plaster and is sometimes almost impossible to remove from the mold. There are two things I use to seal the clay: ColorWorks clear plastic spray and Glatsan plastic cap material. Glatsan as it comes is very thick. What I do is thin it down 50-50 or more with acetone to use on the sculpture. I prefer to use plastic cap because it doesn't stick to the plaster at all. What it does do is stick well to the clay. When you peel the clay from inside the mold, there's virtually no cleanup. Glatsan also peels off the clay in large pieces so you can reuse it. ColorWorks plastic spray works okay, but it tends to stick to the mold and needs to be removed with acetone. There's a real pain. So spend a few more dollars on Glatsan plastic and save yourself some headaches. No matter which sealer you decide on, make sure you have plenty of ventilation. In my shop, I have an elephant's trunk ventilation system that pulls all the fumes away. If you have any doubts about the ventilation, seal your sculpture outside. Use a medium-sized brush to apply the plastic. Apply the plastic a few strokes at a time. If you try to brush the plastic out too much, it will create globs of plastic on the surface of the sculpture. For large areas, a 1-inch brush is used. Mold making can take all day. Make sure to start early, and I'd recommend an assistant to help. Get all the materials needed together and lay them out so you know where they are when you need them. Water clay is used to divide the horns in half. A clay cutter can be made by nailing 2 strips of wood to each side of a plywood base. Place the water clay on the board and pull a wire through using the rails on each side as guides. Place the horns on a mat of clay. Build up the surrounding clay to divide the horns in half. Use a soft brush to smooth out and seal the water clay against the horns. Vaseline acts as a separator, keeping the water clay from sticking to the plaster. This will also speed cleanup. Use a Q-tip to wipe away any excess water clay or Vaseline from the seam where the clay touches the horns. Registration keys are cut into the corners of the mold. United States Gypsum, USG, carries 3 plasters that I use for mold making. USG No. 1 pottery plaster, white hydrocal, and hydrostone. All of them work well. For the molds made in this video, I'm using USG No. 1 pottery plaster. For more durable molds, I use a combination of white hydrocal and hydrostone. I mix the plaster in a 2-to-1 ratio. 2 scoops hydrocal, 1 scoop hydrostone. Always fluff the plaster before adding it to the water. Shake the plaster in evenly. It's not absolutely necessary to measure the plaster and water. As a rule of thumb, add enough plaster to absorb all the water. That's it. Wait until the plaster has absorbed all the water before mixing. It should look like the bottom of a dry riverbed. A large spatula is handy to mix the plaster. Stir until it's thoroughly mixed, about 1 minute. Once the plaster is mixed, tap the bucket on the floor to bring the air bubbles to the surface. These bubbles can be popped with a quick spray of alcohol. You're ready to paint on the splash coat. Brush the plaster onto the sculpture. Work the plaster into all the detail. Be careful not to trap any air as you apply the splash coat. Any air trapped between the plaster and the sculpture will reproduce on the finished piece as a wart or ridge. Once the splash coat is painted on, pour the rest of the plaster in, slowly filling the mold. The plaster needs time to cure before the second half is cast. When the plaster hardens, it heats up. You should wait until the mold has cooled down before casting the second half. It's okay to start to prepare the second half while the first half is slightly warm. Remove the clay wall from around the mold. Carefully peel the water clay off the mold. Use a soft brush dipped in water to remove any water clay residue. Brush over the sculpture lightly to remove all traces of clay. After the mold is dried, a separator is brushed onto the exposed plaster. Vaseline can be used as a separator. A better choice is a wax-based separator. I use Pardal paste wax. If Vaseline is used, I recommend 2 coats, waiting a few minutes between each coat. Any excess separator should be carefully wiped off the sculpture with a Q-tip. Build a wall around the mold and you're ready for plaster. Mix the plaster and apply the splash coat in the same way as before. It's better to mix up a little more plaster than you think you will need. A little too much plaster is better than not enough. Let the second half of the mold heat up and cool down. Remove the wall from around the mold. Use a plaster rasp or utility knife to clean up the edges. Pry the mold apart with a putty knife or thin tool. Be careful not to pry near the sculpture. You don't want to chip the edges of the mold next to the piece. The horns are removed from the mold. The mold is strapped together. Strong rubber bands could also be used. The holes left by the dowel pins are drilled out. Pour some latex into a small container. A mold with points like this horn mold sometimes trap air in the tips. To keep this from happening, pour a little latex into one half of the mold before closing it. A Q-tip is used to work latex into the tip. Strap the mold together and pour it full. Leave the latex in the mold for about an hour. As the liquid in the latex is absorbed by the plaster, a layer of rubber solids is built up on the inside surface of the mold. The longer you leave the latex in the mold, the thicker the layer will be. After an hour, the mold is turned upside down to drain. Let the mold drain for about 10 minutes. I use a hairdryer to speed dry the latex. Aim the hairdryer at the mold. The heat will speed up the curing time of the latex. A mold like this, left to air dry, may take a day or 2. With speed drying, it's ready in 2 or 3 hours. By the way, never leave the dryer unattended. Once the latex is cured, sprinkle or spoon in a little baby powder into the pore holes and shake it around. This will keep the latex from sticking to itself when you remove it from the mold. Open the mold and remove the horns. Any flash along the seam can be trimmed with scissors. When you cast a mask that's been sculpted on a head bust, the main thing you want to remember is to divide the mask in relation to where the head bust is underneath the clay. If your dividing wall is placed too far forward or too far back, there's a very good chance that the bust underneath will be locked in one side of the mold or the other. I recommend you study exactly where the bust is under the clay to avoid any problems. The ears and neck are the most common problem spots. Some careful planning now can save you a lot of trouble later. Cut and lay out enough clay to do the job. Start by covering any exposed areas of the bust with water clay. When trimming the water clay, be careful not to gouge the sculpture. The bust needs to be covered to keep it from getting stuck in either half of the mold. To give the mold a little more room when filled with latex, I put a couple blocks under the head form. The gap between the bust and table is filled with water clay. Smooth out the water clay with Vaseline. Drawing a line on the sculpture with a magic marker will help you place the dividing wall. Cut the water clay into strips an inch wide. The back of the mask is cast first. This will allow me to lay the sculpture down to cast the front half. Place the strips of clay you have cut on the mask. Gently press the water clay against the sculpture. Small chunks of clay are placed behind the clay wall for support. The idea is, when you press on the dividing wall, to make a 90-degree angle with the clay. You want to create a strong square edge where the two mold halves fit together. Due to the size and detail in the ears, this mold needs to be divided along the edge of the ears. This will allow me to remove the mask from the mold. Once the wall has been pressed into place, the edge next to the sculpture is smoothed out. I use a soft brush and a little Vaseline. Do not use water to smooth out the seam. The water softens the grip of the clay, allowing it to pull away from the sculpture. If this happens during the splash coat, it could be disaster. Vaseline is applied to the rest of the clay wall. A rounded wire loop tool is used to cut a key into the clay dividing wall. This type of key is called a gutter key. It serves two purposes. It acts as a key to align the two mold halves together, and the shape of the key running all the way around the seam stops any latex from leaking when the mold is filled. The sharp edges of the gutter key are smoothed out with your fingers and a little Vaseline. The back half of the mask is ready for casting. For a mold of this size, an assistant will be mixing continuous batches of plaster as the mold is built up. A half bucket of plaster, about 2 quarts, is mixed and the air bubbles removed. Brush on the splash coat. Brush the plaster into all the wrinkles and detail. Start from the bottom and work your way up across the sculpture. This helps you from trapping air bubbles. Work quickly and carefully. Build up the thickness of the plaster as you cover the sculpture. When you're brushing plaster onto a sculpture like this that's standing up, gravity will be working against you. Don't rush the plaster too much, or you'll end up with most of it sliding off the sculpture onto the work table. As the plaster starts to thicken, you'll be able to build up the splash coat. When the plaster is too thick to brush on, carefully smooth on the rest by hand. Continue building up the splash coat till it's a ½ inch thick all over. A large batch of plaster is mixed as the splash coat sets up. This is the reinforcement layer. Start by smoothing on a thin layer of plaster over the splash coat. This helps the burlap stick better. The burlap strips are dipped into the plaster and some of the excess is squeezed off. Start at the base of the mold and work your way up. Overlap each strip about a ½ inch. Smooth each burlap strip into the splash coat. Work your way around the edge of the mold with burlap strips. Keep the strips about a ½ inch from the edge of the mold. Use the clay wall as a guide in determining the thickness of the mold. A mold with a 1-inch thickness overall is what you're shooting for. Work from bottom to top, then side to side, applying burlap strips 2 layers thick. Once 2 layers of burlap strips are laid on, the rest of the plaster is smoothed over top. This sandwiches the burlap in between the plaster, creating a very strong mold. One more batch of plaster is mixed as I finish the burlap. Continue to smooth the final layer of plaster with your hands or a spatula. To get the plaster smooth as it sets up, I dip my hands in a little water and finish smoothing the mold. The back half of the mold needs about an hour to cure. As it is curing, carefully clean up the bottom edge of the mold and turn it around. Carefully peel the clay wall away from the sculpture. A soft brush dipped in water is used to gently wash away any water clay that is left behind. Start at the top of the mold and work your way down each side. Cotton balls are used to blot up any water that is left behind. The sculpture is ready to be laid down. Clean up the edge of the mold all the way around. Apply Pardol or Vaseline to the seam of the mold. Use the brush to apply a good layer close to the sculpture. Areas away from the sculpture can be waxed with your fingertips. Make sure any globs of separator are cleaned off of the sculpture. Rub a little separator on the outside of the mold. This will keep any plaster that runs over the edge from sticking. It makes cleanup of the mold a lot easier. A board is hot glued to the bottom of the mold to create a dam around the bottom edge. The last step is to place clay wedges around the mold. This will give you a place to pry the mold apart when you're finished. Place the wedges on the mold outside the gutter key 6 to 8 inches apart. The second half of the mold is ready to cast. Due to the complex depressions in the ear areas, each ear is filled with plaster before the rest of the mask is splash coated. The sculpture is tipped to one side and blocked up. A small batch of plaster is brushed into each ear area, filling it full. Once each ear is filled, the entire sculpture is covered with a splash coat. A more human sculpture wouldn't need to be cast in this way. A single splash coat would work just fine. Brush the splash coat from the base of the sculpture. Be careful not to trap any air. As the plaster thickens, smooth on the rest with your hands. Make sure the plaster is built up around any horns that stick out of the sculpture. As I'm finishing the splash coat, another large batch of plaster is mixed for the reinforcement layer. Cover the mold with 2 layers of bandages. A final batch of plaster is mixed as I smooth out the last batch. Apply plaster to any areas you feel are too thin. Continue to smooth out the final coat of plaster until it sets. Once the mold has cured, remove the board from the bottom of the mold. Shave away the plaster along the seam to expose the pry points. A utility knife can also be used, but be careful. At this point, you can stand the mold upright to work on the seam along the top. Remove the clay from the pry points. A pair of screwdrivers are used to carefully pry the mold apart. Work slowly and pry into each point. Be careful not to pry too close to the inner edge of the mold, or you will damage the seam. Once the mold is open enough, you can pry with your fingers. The back half of the mold usually comes off pretty easily. The front half will take a little work. Remove the water clay from around the bust. The rest of the clay is carefully removed from the back of the bust. Once enough clay is cleared away from around the head bust, it can be pulled from the front half of the mold. Notice the clearance around the ears on the bust. If you realize that the bust is stuck in one half of the mold, you can use a hammer and chisel to chip away part of the bust. The bust can easily be repaired. Remove the rest of the clay from the front half. The chin and snout are the last areas to go. Use a wire loop tool and carefully dig the clay out from the center and fold the clay in on itself to remove it. The water clay residue is wiped from the mold with a damp rag. I use alcohol, cotton swabs, and Q-tips to remove any traces of clay. After a close examination of both halves of the mold, I noticed a few air bubbles in the back half. To repair any air bubbles or chips in the mold, you'll need a spray bottle full of water, Q-tips, and a pointed tool. With the spray bottle, wet the area to be repaired. Mix a small batch of plaster. A thin batch works best. With the pointed tool, drip the plaster into the air bubbles. Add enough plaster to fill the holes. A Q-tip dipped in water is used to smooth and shape the repair. Any excess plaster is wiped away with a wet Q-tip. This technique can be used to repair almost any defect in the mold. For large molds like this, a cradle can be made to hold the mold when the mask is poured. Build a water clay dam around the top of the mold. Make sure it's at least an inch above the top of the mold. Fill the pry points with clay and apply Vaseline or mold wax to the exposed plaster. Splash coat the clay wall and let it set up. This will keep the wall from blowing out when you fill it with plaster. Mix a large batch of plaster and pour the cradle full. I also add a layer of burlap in for strength. When the plaster has set, remove the clay wall and pop the cradle off. Here's how the cradle holds the mask. Let the mold air dry for 24 hours before pouring the mask. Mydrin R&D 407 latex is one of the best mask-making latex around. Depending on the size of your mold, you'll need between 3 and 5 gallons of latex. It's better to have a little too much than not enough. In cold or humid weather, leave the latex in the mold longer, up to 2 hours. The actual mask will only use up about a quart of latex or so. 5 gallons of latex will make quite a few masks, a whole army of aliens, zombies, or whatever. Mold straps are needed to hold the two halves of the mold together. An alternative to mold straps are thick rubber bungee cords. Position the mold on the floor. If you didn't make a cradle, use concrete blocks to keep the mold from tipping over. Pour the latex in slowly. Once the mold is full, cover the latex with a sheet of plastic wrap. The plastic keeps the rubber from forming a skin. Leave the latex in the mold for 1 hour. If you don't have enough latex to fill the mold, pour the latex you have in. Roll the mold around to coat the entire mask. This isn't the best way to pour a mask, but it works. Remove the plastic wrap. Pour the latex back into the container it came in. Get help to pour off the latex if you need it. The mold is positioned over top of the bucket to drain. Let the mold drain for about 10 minutes. Lay the mold on its side. The mask is speed dried with a hairdryer on low heat and air settings. The latex left in the mold will still tend to pool in the side of the mask facing down. For the first 15 minutes of speed drying, flip the mold from front to back every 3 minutes or so to keep the latex from pooling in one spot. As the latex cures, the flash around the bottom of the mask is peeled back to check the thickness. I decided a second coat was needed. Let the first coat dry until it's lost its wet sheen. When the second coat is poured, it only needs to be left in the mold a few minutes before draining. 2 coats of latex make a sturdy mask that holds its shape. Speed dry the second coat as mentioned before. Speed drying the latex takes 2 or 3 hours. When the mask is completely cured, the latex will turn a deep tan color. Baby powder is sprinkled into the mask to keep it from sticking to itself. A large brush helps spread the powder into all the detail on the mask. To remove a mask like this, the mold is opened to get the ears out. The mask is slowly peeled out of the mold. Be careful not to chip off any detail as you remove the mask. Once the mask is out of the mold, stuff it full of loosely crumpled newspaper to help hold its shape. The mask is placed on a mask stand. A mask stand can be made by mixing an inch or two of plaster in a flat bucket. As the plaster sets, A wood dowel is pressed into the center. After looking at the mask, an air void was discovered on the snout. This defect can be repaired. Latex is built up layer by layer and dried with a hairdryer. Build up the latex a little higher than the surrounding area. A Dremel Moto tool is used to smooth out the repair. Trim the flash off the mask with a small pair of scissors. Any latex warts are trimmed off. The eyes are cut out by popping the eye holes inside out. The Dremel tool is used to smooth out the seam along the edge of the mask. The mask is ready for painting. The sketches that were used to sculpt the mask are put to good use again. A color scheme is worked out with colored pencils. Color photographs that were used as reference material are used to choose colors. Masks are best painted with an airbrush. Pache sells a good Model H available at most hobby and art stores. If you plan on making a few different masks, now would be a good time to invest in an airbrush and an electric compressor. Instead of an airbrush, your mask can be painted with rubber mask grease paints. Miron sells a good grease paint palette that can be used to color your mask. A sponge and makeup brush are used to apply the color. Mydron Latex Co. carries the paint base I use to airbrush my masks. Liquid acrylic paints are used for color. I use liquid acrylic paints that come in hundreds of colors. They're cheap and ready to use. Universal colorants can also be used. They come in primary colors and must be mixed for various shades. The basic formula for mixing the latex paint is 60% paint base, 20% acrylic color, and 20% water. The water is added to thin the paint enough to flow through an airbrush. Use this formula as a starting point. You may need to add more or less paint or water to get the formula to work for you. Fill the airbrush bottle with paint formula. Use a piece of cardboard to adjust the flow of paint. Paint the base coat on evenly. A slit should be cut in the back of the mask before painting. A paper punch is used to punch a hole at the end of the slit. This hole will keep the slit from tearing any further. Holes are punched into the mouth area for better ventilation. Brown and black are airbrushed on to accent the folds and wrinkles. Black is sprayed into the ears to create depth. Yellow highlights are sprayed onto the eyebrows, edges of ears, and the cheeks of the mask. A wash of green is used to tone down the dark color on the back scales. Basically, what you want to do is use light colors on the high spots and darker colors in the low areas. White is sprayed on the tongue and mouth as a base coat. The eyes are sprayed white. Use the smallest tip your airbrush has for any fine detail. An alternative would be to use a brush to paint the color on. When you airbrush this paint formula, the tip of the airbrush frequently gets clogged. To clear the tip, close the nozzle and use an old toothbrush to remove the globs of paint. This usually works. If it doesn't, the tip needs to be removed and cleaned with a pipe cleaner. It's a good idea to remove and clean the tip between each color change. There's no substitute for practice with an airbrush. Just be patient and keep at it. A combination of white, red, and blue are used to color the tongue and gums. Yellow is used again to brighten up the high spots, including the snout and points down the back of the mask. Yellow is also used to highlight the tops of the shoulders. White is the last color to be used to highlight the high spots over the yellow. The horns are painted brown all over. A neat effect can be created by using alcohol on a Q-tip or cotton ball. Carefully rub the raised edges of the tusk. This will remove the brown and expose the tan latex underneath. The same technique is used for the horns on the mask. A little white is sprayed on the very tips for highlight. Black is used to darken the base of the tusk. Matte and gloss sealer are used to seal the painted mask. The mask must be sealed to keep the paint from rubbing off. Matte sealer is sprayed on over the entire mask. Gloss sealer is used in the mouth, on the eyes, and the tusks to give it a wet look. Colorworks clear plastic spray also works very well to seal the mask. Friendly plastic is used to make the teeth. Pour the plastic into hot water. After a few minutes, the plastic melts. A tool is used to grab a small blob of plastic. Use your fingers to shape the plastic into a tooth. The clay teeth that were made earlier can be used as a guide. Scissors can be used to trim the plastic before it hardens. Check the fit of the teeth in the mask as you go. Brown is airbrushed at the base of each tooth. The painted teeth are sealed with Colorworks clear plastic spray. There are several different adhesives that can be used to glue the teeth and tusks to the mask. Silicone-based adhesives work very well. Apply a little to each tooth and stick them in place. The tusks are glued in the same way. Here's the finished mask. The mask I made for this video is pretty complex. I wanted to give you all the information I could in this video so you can create anything you want. You may want to start with something simple. The choice is yours. I wish everyone good luck, and remember, have fun!